away from the city, in a desolate stretch surrounded by fields, Joe waited for someone. Within moments, the wait was over. He raised his gun and took aim. Suddenly, before him appeared a man with his hands and feet tied. In the very next second, Joe fired a single shot straight into his chest. Calmly, he walked over, pulled out a knife, and tore open the man's clothes from behind. Strapped to his back were 4 silver bars, and the sight made Joe's face light up with uncontainable delight. Joe tossed the man's corpse into his truck, drove it to an abandoned factory, and shoved it into the roaring furnace. Just like that, his day's work was done. The year was 2044. Humanity had advanced far in science, yet time travel remained nothing more than a dream for researchers. But according to Joe, 30 years from now, time travel would finally be discovered. Of course, the moment it emerged, the government would brand it illegal and swiftly impose a ban on its use. In the future, a powerful criminal organization would secretly use time travel to cover up their crimes. Joe already knew this, because he worked for the very same syndicate, feared across eras as the mob. According to Joe, 30 years ahead, in the year 2074, anyone committing murder or a serious crime would find it impossible to hide. Escaping the police would be hopeless, for by then, every human being would carry an implanted tracker, instantly broadcasting identity and location to the authorities. That meant criminals could no longer kill their enemies and dispose of the bodies, but the mob had already found a way around it. Whenever they needed someone eliminated, they relied on certain hired killers in the present, known as loopers. Joe was one of them. In the future, the mob would first capture their target, bind their hands and feet, cover their face with cloth, and then, using a time machine, send them back into the present, right into the waiting sights of a looper. Each looper had a fixed spot where their target would appear. All they were given was the exact moment the victim would arrive from the future. The instant the target materialized, the looper would fire a shot and later incinerate the body. That way, the target simply vanished from the future, leaving no trace, and the mob remained untouchable. Along with the target, silver bars were strapped to their back, a tidy reward for the loopers' deadly work. The mob was also tied to a present-day mafia company that kept strict watch over the loopers. The job gave loopers a life of luxury, but it turned into a nightmare when retirement came due. Since time travel was so forbidden in the future, the mob refused to leave any evidence behind. So when it was time to retire a looper, they would send back the looper's own future self, 30 years older, as the target. That final assignment was the grim closure of their contract. The looper's future self always arrived with their face covered, so the younger looper never realized the target was actually themselves, 30 years older. Believing it to be just another mark, they pulled the trigger, erasing their own future in an instant. This grim ritual was called closing the loop. The truth revealed itself only when, instead of silver, the looper found stacks of gold bars strapped to the target's back. Gold meant retirement. Their service was over, and the bars were their reward for the final job. Lately, something strange had been happening. In the past, a looper was retired only once in a while, but now, day after day, loops were being closed one after another. Joe didn't worry. He lived only in the present. By now, he had amassed plenty of silver bars from his work. After each job, he'd head to the mob's club, drowning himself in drugs. And every day, he also spent some time at a cafe where a waitress named Beatrix had grown into one of his closest friends. By then, nearly 10% of the world's population had developed telekinetic abilities, the power to lift objects by focusing on them. Still, their strength was limited. Most could manage only small things like coins. Among them was Seth, himself a looper and also Joe's close friend. One night, as Joe slept peacefully at home, Seth suddenly climbed through his window, visibly shaken and terrified. Alarmed, Joe sat up and asked his friend what had scared him so badly. Seth, trembling, explained, "Today the mob sent me a target from the future." His face was covered with cloth, but the moment he appeared, he began humming a tune, the same lullaby my mother used to sing to me as a child. That's when I realized the target was none other than my own future self. I was meant to kill him and close my loop. But before pulling the trigger, I wanted to see his face. So I pulled off the cover, and he told me that in the future,
The mob has a new boss, the Rainmaker.
He's clearing out all the loopers, Seth said. The Rainmaker wants them retired. One by one, he sends our future selves back here to be killed. As Seth finished, his future self bolted from the room. I could have shot him. I didn't. Now the mob's men were closing in on Seth. If they killed me, my future would vanish with me. Seth panicked, fell to his knees, begging Joe for mercy. At that exact moment, mob enforcers reached Joe's door and began hammering on it. Sensing the danger, Joe hid Seth in a secret locker in the basement, the same place where he stashed his silver bars. Then, Joe opened the door as mob enforcers flooded inside, searching for Seth, but he was nowhere to be found. Among them was a man called Kid Blue. Kid Blue told Joe, "You're coming with us now. The boss wants to see you." Joe went along with Kid Blue. Their boss was Ebb, an operative sent from the future by the mob years ago. Ebb had arrived, built a sprawling crime empire, and now his word ruled the whole city. Ebb looked Joe in the eye and said, "I know Seth has nowhere else to run but to you. So here are your choices. Either you give him up or we seize every last silver bar you've been saving for your future." Joe hesitated, caught in thought. Deep down, he knew that sooner or later, Seth was doomed to be caught. Weighing his options, Joe chose to protect his silver and finally gave away Seth's location. Meanwhile, old Seth ran for his life, until, like a scar resurfacing, an address appeared on his hand. It meant young Seth had been captured. Ebb's men had carved that address into old Seth's skin to lure him there. Old Seth was simply young Seth's future self, so whatever befell the younger man would echo in him. He tried to ignore it and keep running, but one by one his 2 fingers vanished, and half his nose was gone. He realized Ebb's men were torturing young Seth, cutting away pieces of him. Before they could finish the job, old Seth stole a car and sped for the address, but then both his legs disappeared too and his car crashed. Old Seth dragged himself out of the wreck and saw the address was close. Crawling on his hands, he reached the spot and banged desperately on the door. But before help could come, both his hands vanished too, proof that Ebb's men had already cut away every limb of young Seth, leaving him clinging only to his final breaths. Just then, the door swung open. Kid Blue stepped out, raised his gun, and fired, ending old Seth's life. At that same moment, the suffering young Seth let out his last breath as well. Joe mourned Seth's death, but it drove home a brutal lesson. Betraying Ebb meant certain doom. Determined never to cross that line, Joe carried on with strict discipline. One day, he waited at his post for the next target. The appointed time passed, but no one appeared. Uneasy, Joe scanned the empty field, when suddenly the target materialized. To his shock, the man's face was uncovered and his hands and feet were free. In that instant, Joe locked eyes with the man, and the color was identical to his own. The truth hit him. This was his future self, old Joe. Unlike Seth, he wouldn't hesitate. He fired, but old Joe spun away, and the bullet struck the gold bar strapped to his back, sparing him. Joe scrambled to reload, but before he could, old Joe rushed him, beat him unconscious, and fled the scene with Joe's truck and gun. When Joe finally regained consciousness, he found a note left behind by old Joe. It read, "Save yourself, leave this city, and run." But Joe knew better. If he fled, Ebe would make his life a living hell. He had to kill old Joe and finish the job. First, he smashed his phone so Ebe's men couldn't track him. Then he returned home to retrieve his gun, only to find the place completely wrecked. The message was clear. Ebe already knew old Joe had escaped and had sent his men after Joe. Joe hurriedly grabbed his hidden stash of cash and his gun. Just then, Kid Blue stormed in and began seizing all his silver bars. Seizing the moment, Joe struck him, shoved him into the basement, and locked the door. He tried reasoning with Kid Blue. "I'll find old Joe soon and finish him myself." But Kid Blue wouldn't relent. He fired through the door in rage. Moments later, another of his men arrived and opened fire as well. Joe dashed toward the fire exit, but in the scramble his grip slipped and he plummeted straight down. At this point, the story twisted back to another timeline. The moment when Joe's target, old Joe, was meant to appear from the future. This time, old Joe materialized with his face covered and his limbs bound. Without hesitation, young Joe fired and ended him in an instant. What we had been watching earlier was the version where old Joe escaped. Now, the tale shifted to the alternate line, where young Joe killed his future self immediately.
And from here, we see what unfolded after that fatal choice.
Seeing the gold bars strapped to old Joe's back, young Joe realized his loop had been closed. His retirement had come. He accepted it willingly. With his wealth, he moved to China, where for 10 years he lived in reckless indulgence. Addicted to drugs, he squandered every coin. When the money ran dry, he slipped back into crime, working alongside Chinese gangsters for the next 23 years. But then, everything changed. Joe fell in love with a Chinese woman. He abandoned the criminal path and married her. His wife saved him, breaking his addiction and pulling him back from death. Joe loved her more than his own life. Time slipped away, and 30 years of Joe's retirement vanished in the blink of an eye. By now, time travel had been invented, and the Rainmaker had risen as the mob's new boss. Every news channel blared with stories of his reign of terror. It was only a matter of time before the Rainmaker's men came for old Joe to drag him 30 years into the past, where his fate would be sealed in the hands of his younger self.
One morning, old Joe awoke to find strange numbers scrawled across his hand. In the very next moment, the Rainmaker's men storm his house, aiming their guns squarely at him. Without resistance, Joe surrendered, but just then, his wife appeared at the doorway. Shocked by her sudden presence, one of the men fired, and she collapsed instantly, dead on the spot. Rage consumed old Joe as he watched his wife die before his eyes. But before he could act, the Rainmaker's men struck him with a taser, jolting him into submission. They bound his hands tightly. Then, with merciless cruelty, they set his wife's body and their home ablaze. Dragging him away, they hauled old Joe to their hidden lair, where the time machine was kept in secret.
After setting the coordinates on the time machine, they began strapping gold bars onto old Joe's back. But in a desperate surge, old Joe freed his hands and brutally beat the 3 men to death. Seizing control, he climbed into the machine himself and hurled back into the past, to young Joe's time. From here, the thread picked up with the version where old Joe had escaped young Joe. Because young Joe failed to kill him, events spiraled differently. In the earlier line, old Joe had slain his future self and walked into a new life, but now the tables had turned. Young Joe couldn't finish old Joe, and the consequence was dire. He was forced to flee, running for his life from Ebb and his men.
Since old Joe was nothing but young Joe's future self, every new event unfolding for young Joe began imprinting itself into old Joe's memory. With each imprint, his old memories faded away. When young Joe returned home for his gun and clashed with Kid Blue and his men, the entire confrontation echoed inside old Joe's mind. That's when he realized young Joe was putting his life in grave danger, and if young Joe died, old Joe would vanish with him. So old Joe rushed to his house, determined to protect him. This was the moment when young Joe scrambled down the fire exit as Kid Blue's man unleashed bullets at him. Dodging fire, he fell, crashing onto a car below, and blacked out. Just before the gunman could finish him off, old Joe appeared, shot the attacker dead, and carried the unconscious young Joe away. When young Joe came to, he found himself near a railway station. Old Joe had left him there, urging him to flee the city. But instead of running, young Joe turned back, heading straight for the city to hunt old Joe down.
But by now, Ebb's men had spread across the entire city, hunting both young Joe and old Joe. Meanwhile, old Joe slipped quietly into a hospital. There, he pulled up a computer and printed a map. On it were marked the locations of 3 children's homes. Carefully, he jotted down the strange number written on his palm onto the map as well. At that moment, old Joe noticed a word etching itself across his palm. Beatrix. The name jolted his memory. It belonged to the waitress at the cafe he used to frequent in his youth. Without hesitation, he headed straight for the cafe. When he arrived, he found young Joe already waiting. In truth, it was young Joe who had carved the word Beatrix into his own hand, summoning him there. As soon as old Joe stepped in, young Joe snapped, "Why don't you get it? If you stay alive, Ebb will kill us both. You've already lived your life. You need to die so that I can live my next 30 years in peace." Old Joe calmed young Joe and said,
In the future, I marry a woman who changes my life completely, but the Rainmaker's men will kill her. I've come back here to alter things, to stop her death." Then he continued, "The Rainmaker is spreading terror across the world. No one knows where he came from. In just 6 months, he seized control of every major mafia syndicate and declared himself their boss, and he did it all alone. They say his mother was murdered when he was a child, leaving him an orphan raised in brutal circumstances. Those hardships twisted him into a bloodthirsty monster. Yet no one truly knows what the Rainmaker looks like or where he hides. I learned all of this from an ex-looper. In the future, the Rainmaker is sending every ex-looper back into the past to be killed, closing their loops one by one. That's why every ex-looper is desperately searching for a way to escape his grasp. Saying this, Old Joe showed young Joe the number he had written down on the hospital map. He continued, "I got this number from an ex-looper. I know the Rainmaker is hiding somewhere in this region. With this number, I can track him down and end him. If I kill him today, there will be no Rainmaker in the future. His men won't kill my wife, nor will they send me back in time. The moment the Rainmaker dies, I'll return to the future, straight back to her." Young Joe snapped, "Why ruin my life to save your wife? Show me her picture. I'll walk away. If she isn't with me, she lives. I'll never meet her again. And in the future, she won't even remember you." Old Joe, furious, replied, "I love her. I won't forget her. I came back to save her." At that, young Joe drew his gun, poised to kill. Old Joe wrestled him, flipping the weapon back onto young Joe. But young Joe had already signaled Ebb's men, who opened fire on Old Joe. He returned fire. In the chaos, young Joe tore a page from Old Joe's map, grabbed another man's gun, and lunged at him. Old Joe shattered out through the cafe window and sprinted toward the sugarcane fields. With Old Joe gone, Ebb's men swarmed after young Joe. He vaulted onto a jet bike and screamed away toward the fields, but he knew the pursuers could trace the bike. So at full speed, he launched the bike into the air and dove away, leaving its trail behind. He ducked away and finally breathed, relieved for a moment. Examining the torn page he'd ripped from Old Joe's map, he noticed a mark, a place nearby. High on drugs, young Joe hid there until night fell. Not far off stood a small house. The owner, Sarah, lived there with her son, Sid. When night fell, young Joe stumbled from the cane fields to the little house. High and parched, he begged Sarah for help, but the sight of his gun made her slam the door shut. Desperate, he lay against it, trembling. Soon Sarah's son, Sid, appeared with a bucket of water. Seeing him, Sid pleaded with his mother to let the stranger stay for the night. Moved by pity, Sarah let young Joe sleep in the storeroom. Morning came, and she returned with her shotgun, telling him to leave at once. Young Joe held out the torn map and asked, "Is this the place?" Sarah studied it and confirmed it was, but then her eyes landed on the numbers scrawled on the paper. In a sudden, terrible flash, she snapped and fired at young Joe. Luckily, Sarah's shotgun wasn't lethal. Young Joe was wounded, not dead. Old Joe, meanwhile, stayed on the run from Ebb's men. Every event young Joe experienced threaded itself into Old Joe's memory. The bullet wound young Joe suffered flared up as an old scar across Old Joe's chest. During this, Sarah confronted young Joe. "Why do you have a map of my house and these numbers?" Young Joe told her everything. Then he asked, "Do you know what these numbers mean?" Sarah replied, "The first digits are a date, 15 July 2019, the day my son Sid was born. The rest of the digits are the postal code of the hospital where Sid came into the world." Hearing this, young Joe froze. "Wait, were there any other children born in that hospital on the same day as your son?" Sarah nodded. "Yes, 2 more." And with that, everything clicked for young Joe. The 3 locations Old Joe had marked on the map were the homes of those 3 children, all born on July 15, 2019 in the same hospital. According to the intel Old Joe carried, one of them would grow up to become the Rainmaker. But Old Joe didn't know which of the 3 children would grow into the Rainmaker, so his plan was to kill them all. Among them was Sarah's own son, Sid. The thought made Sarah's fear spiral even further. Young Joe, however, never told her the full truth, that the killer from the future was his own older self.
If he had, Sarah would have killed young Joe on the spot, which would have erased old Joe as well, leaving her child safe. Young Joe told Sarah, "I let my target slip, and now Ebb's men are hunting me down. But if you let me hide here, I'll protect your boy. That killer will take out the other 2 children first, then he'll come for Sid. When he does, I'll kill him. That way, both of us win." Sarah agreed, and from that moment, young Joe stood guard outside her house, keeping watch.
It was the apartment where old Joe's next victim, the second child, lived. Old Joe began to scope the place, unaware that Ebb's man, Kid Blue, was watching him through CCTV. Meanwhile, Ebb's other operative, Jace, had tracked young Joe to Sarah's house. Sensing danger, young Joe hid in a room. Jace posed as an FBI agent, showed Sarah photos of young Joe and old Joe, and said, "These 2 are father and son, fugitives wanted by the police. I suspect one of them is hiding somewhere in this neighborhood." Saying this, Jace forced his way into Sarah's home to search it. Sarah had already realized who he really was, but stopping him would only raise suspicion. Young Joe was trapped. No way out in sight. Just then, Sid quietly led him into a hidden room. From there, a tunnel stretched underground. Sid guided young Joe through it and out of the house. When Jace found nothing inside, he left, and young Joe narrowly escaped with his life. Sid explained that the tunnel had been built by his grandfather to protect the family from bandits. Grateful, young Joe thanked both Sid and Sarah. By now, Sarah had begun to like young Joe too. That night, she invited him into her room to spend some time together. While there, young Joe noticed Sarah lift a lighter into the air with her hand, revealing that she too possessed telekinetic powers. In conversation, Sarah revealed to young Joe that when Jace had shown her the photos of him and old Joe, she had immediately realized the killer after Sid was actually young Joe's future self. Yet she trusted him now, trusted that he would eventually kill old Joe and protect Sid. That trust was why she had shielded him from Jace. That night, young Joe and Sarah shared tender, intimate moments together. The next morning, young Joe woke to find Sarah missing from the bed. When he went downstairs, Jace was there again, this time holding Sarah hostage. Seeing the situation, young Joe lowered his gun and said, "Let her go, we can figure this out." Jace released her, and young Joe pleaded, "I want to face my future self myself. He'll be here soon. Give me a chance to fix my mistake. In return, I'll give you the 948 silver bars I've got." But Jace refused, determined to drag young Joe back to Ebb. At that moment, Sid came out of the upstairs room. The sight of him made Jace whip his gun toward the boy. Startled, Sid stumbled backward, his foot slipping on the stairs, sending him tumbling down. Seeing this, young Joe sprinted after him with Sarah close behind. Young Joe was just about to catch Sid when something happened. Something almost impossible to believe. Instead of rushing to save Sid, Sarah grabbed young Joe and dragged him outside. The moment Sid hit the floor, everything inside the house lifted into the air. In the next instant, Sid rose, screaming furiously at Jace. Before anyone could react, Jace was hurled upward, blood gushing from his chest. A violent whirlwind tore through the room, ripping Jace to shreds in midair. This terrifying incident was the result of Sid's fear and rage. He too had telekinetic powers, but unlike the others, he could control not just small objects, but everything around him with his mind. Yet he was still just a child, unable to master his abilities. Whenever fear struck him, or anger, chaos erupted, and whoever happened to be in front of him at that moment almost always paid with their life. That was why even Sarah feared her son's uncontrollable fury. Meanwhile, old Joe had reached the room of the second child, ready to kill. But suddenly, memories from young Joe's side flashed in his mind. Witnessing Sid's powers through those memories, old Joe realized the truth. Sid was the one destined to become the Rainmaker.
He turned away from the second child, intent on hunting Sid instead. Just then, Kid Blue, lying in wait, struck him with a taser gun, knocking him down and dragging him back to their hideout. On the other side, young Joe had also realized the truth, that Sid would one day become the Rainmaker. He entered the house searching, but Sid was nowhere to be found. Turning to Sarah, he said, "Your son Sid is destined to become a deranged killer, the Rainmaker. If he survives, he could bring destruction to the world." Saying this, young Joe too set off to hunt Sid down. But Sarah fell to her knees begging, "Sid is still just an innocent child."
Sarah pleaded, "But he'll learn to control his powers. I'll raise him well so that he grows into a good man, using his gifts the right way."
Still, young Joe wasn't convinced. He pushed on toward the sugarcane fields in search of Sid. A little further in, he found him, Sid, his face smeared with blood, yet gazing at young Joe with pure innocence. The sight melted young Joe's heart. Just then, Sarah arrived. Young Joe knew old Joe would have already learned about Sid through their shared memories, and that he would now know Sid's exact location. He urged Sarah, "Take Sid and get far away before old Joe comes." Meanwhile, Kid Blue had dragged old Joe back to Eb's hideout. As one of Eb's men frisked him before taking him inside, old Joe seized the moment, snatched Kid Blue's gun, and shot him in the leg.
Old Joe then grabbed a machine gun and within minutes wiped out Eb and his entire gang. He walked away, though Kid Blue was still alive. Meanwhile, young Joe had left Sarah and Sid behind and stepped onto the road. Just then, old Joe arrived in a truck loaded with all of Eb's gold and silver bars. He told young Joe, "I brought you a truck full of riches and killed all your enemies. Take it, leave this place, live a life of comfort, and let me finish my mission." But young Joe could never let Sid die. He opened fire on old Joe. At that moment, Kid Blue roared in on a jet bike, attacking both young Joe and old Joe. Young Joe turned his aim and cut Kid Blue down. In the chaos, however, old Joe seized the chance and escaped. Meanwhile, Sarah had just pulled out in her truck with Sid when old Joe appeared ahead of them with his gun. The sight of him terrified Sid, unleashing his powers, and their truck flipped over. Luckily, neither Sarah nor Sid was badly hurt. They scrambled out of the wreck and ran toward the fields until Sarah suddenly stumbled and fell. Sid turned back to look at Sarah, and in that instant, old Joe fired. The shot hurled Sid to the ground. For a moment, it seemed old Joe had succeeded in his mission. But then, everything around them began to rise into the air. Fueled by rage, Sid stood back up. The bullet had only grazed his jaw, leaving him wounded but alive. Then Sid glared at old Joe with burning fury. Instantly, a violent whirlwind tore through the fields. Both Sarah and old Joe were lifted high into the air. The storm was so fierce that even young Joe, arriving in his truck, was caught in its pull, his vehicle flipping over in the chaos. Sid's fury was so overwhelming that his power could have torn both Sarah and old Joe to shreds. But then Sarah gently called out to him, calming him down. Hearing his mother's voice, Sid slowly regained control, and both Sarah and old Joe dropped back to the ground. Yet in the very next moment, old Joe rose again, aiming his gun at Sid once more. Seeing this, Sarah told Sid to run into the fields while she covered him. By then, young Joe had also arrived, but he was too far away. His gun didn't have the range to hit old Joe. Now, Sarah stood squarely in old Joe's sights, and he was about to pull the trigger. At that moment, a thought struck young Joe. Old Joe had once told him that, as a child, the Rainmaker's mother had been killed. It dawned on young Joe that old Joe himself was the very reason Sid would grow up to become the Rainmaker. If old Joe killed Sarah today, that moment would spark Sid's transformation. Watching his mother die, Sid's rage would ignite. He might escape, but he would be left an orphan, growing up battered by hardship, his heart filling with hatred for humanity. And it was that hatred that would one day shape him into the Rainmaker. In the future, Sid would slaughter every looper to avenge himself against Old Joe and unleash chaos upon the world. Old Joe had come back in time to kill the Rainmaker and change destiny, but unknowingly, he was becoming the very cause of Sid's rise. Young Joe saw only one way left to stop him. He pressed the gun to his own chest and pulled the trigger. With young Joe's death, his future self vanished instantly. Sarah's life was spared, and Sid returned safely to her side. By sacrificing himself, young Joe had cut off the dark seed of the Rainmaker growing inside Sid. In the years to come, under Sarah's care, the boy would grow into a good man and choose the path of kindness. Friends, many of you have said that our videos aren't reaching you. To fix this, simply hit the subscribe button, click the notification bell, and select all. That way, you'll never miss an update and every new video will reach you directly.